Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Kaf Daled. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with a quick review, and then we're going to get right into the Dama ben Natina story, a very, very well-known story. We're now going to just review. Our Mishnah started off, you can't leave your animals in places that are watched by Gentiles, in a pundak, because there's a concern that the Gentile will have the animal engaged in bestiality, because Gentiles were suspect for that. Then we had a brayta that said, but you can buy animals from Gentiles, right? Which seemed a little bit strange for sacrifices. How can you do that if there's a concern the animal engaged in bestiality? We have Rav who said, no, their own animals they watch because they don't want the animals to not be able to bear offspring. And there was a concern if they engage in bestiality, that would prevent that. Whereas other people's animals, they don't really care about. And we had another one, lechatchila b'diavad, ideally, and then, after the fact. Then we had Rabbi Padat, and we're in the middle of that one, which said, oh, one is Rabbi Eliezer, one is the rabbis. They represent different opinions. And within the context of discussing Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that there's a concern of the bestiality, we had Sheila, who said, my time at Rabbi Eliezer, okay, and I'm going to start from the Gufa at the bottom of Kaf Gimel, Dirtiv Daber b'nei Israel v'yikchu b'nei Israel. So right, they'll acquire the Par Aduma. And then it said, right, Yakichu. The ain of de kochavim yakichu, right? You can't buy it from Gentiles. You can only buy it from Jews. Okay, and that's why it says me'et b'nei, right? V'yikchu b'nei Israel, v'yakichu b'nei Israel. They will acquire it from Jews. Okay, and that's his drasha. So then we said, El Me'ata, what about this v'kuli truma by the Mishkan? When it comes to the Mishkan, right? So Rabbi Eliezer said it actually about paraduma. And then that we can't have animals from Gentiles from Paraduma. But what about the Mishkan? The Mishkan also says V'ikuli Truma. Why don't we darshan in the same way? Because there we know that we have this famous story. Okay, so Shalu Hamar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Shalu at Rabbi Eliezer ad hechan kibur aveim. V'im amar lehem su'uru ma'asau ve'kochavim echad lavi b'ashkelon v'dama ben netina shmo. Right? To what extent do we have to keep kibur aveim? Right? This is the story they always teach little children. Why it's so important to keep kibbud av aim. Look at the story of Dama ben Natina, and there's a bunch of different versions of the story. They wanted avanim leifo. We're finally getting to the top of our daf. Bishishim ribo sachar. Okay, it was going to cost them 600,000 coins or dinarim. Rav Kahana matne b'shmonim ribo. Okay, he said 800,000. Vayum avtechot munachot tacha merashatav shel aviv. And the key to get these was under the head of his father. And he wouldn't wake up his father to get this. So what do you see here? They were going to buy it from this Gentile. And that he was used as the prime example of kibbud avayim, of respect for your parents. Wouldn't wake his father up, even for all this money they wanted to buy it from. So now the answer, why is that not an issue, even though theoretically the kuli truma would mean you can only take it from the Jewish people? So the answer, because it says, right, right, and basically it sounds like the context is the Jewish people, should be only acquired from them. So they say, avnei shoham hifsika inyan. There's a lot of vavs, and each thing connects to the previous, but then avnei shoham comes without a vav, and therefore they say, this is a break. From here, you don't have to purchase from a Jew, okay? And that's separated it. But then they say, but then it says the avnei miluim, and it puts a vav, which then connects it back. So that's not really a good proof. The odd, and furthermore, we have another question, which is Katani Seifa. The Seifa of that story of Dama ben Natina says, L'shana acheret nodalo paraduma be'edro. Also by Dama ben Natina, there's a story with the paraduma. And then you can't say, there was a break in the section because Rabbi Eliezer halacha was said about the paraduma. And nichnesu chachmei Israel etzlo. So the rabbis came, and remember, who was the one who said? It was Rabbi Eliezer who said, right, look at how far you need to do kibbud avayim. Use Dama as his example. So what happened? Amar lahem. So the Chachamim said, Yodani bachem shimani mevakesh b'kem kol mamon sheba'olam aten. So Dama says, I know that you will give me all the money in the world for this paraduma. They were incredibly rare. They say there were like 7 paradumas ever. Achshav eini mevakesh mikem ela oto mamon shefsadti b'shvil av. I only want the money that I lost from not waking up my father that time. So Hatam, so what's the answer? So now we have a problem because clearly, right, it can be used for, you can use buy from a Gentile for the paraduma, and which seems to go against Rabbi Eliezer himself. There's contradiction. And we have this issue of the Avnei Shoham that they also bought from Dama ben Netina, to which they answer, Hatam al Yidei Tagare Israel Zabim. Now we're going to learn it's a little bit of an interesting heter, but if a Jew bought the item not for the purposes of buying it for paraduma or not for the purposes of using it for the ephod, but bought the stones or the paraduma or whatever it might be from the Gentile, and then the temple or whoever it was purchases it from the Jew for the purpose of using it for the temple or for the paraduma, then it's permitted. Okay, so we now have this big heter that if it was done by a middle person, then it's allowed. And the middle person was a Jew, right? The Jew purchased it from the Gentile, and then whoever's using it for the purpose they want, for the sanctified purpose, purchases it from the Jew. That's our solution. Now we say, wait a minute. Rabbi Eliezer, okay, we started with this gufa of Sheila saying, what's the reason for Rabbi Eliezer? Because it says, Vayikhu b'nei Israel, which they understand is Vayakichu b'nei Israel, right? It comes from the Jews. But isn't there a different reason? For Rabbi Eliezer, Lochaish l'Ravia, isn't it that he's concerned for bestiality? The Hatanya, and doesn't it say in a Braita, Amrula l'Rabbi Eliezer, Ma'asev l'kol min of Havei Kochavim, v'Dama Shmo. There was a Maaseh where they purchased the paraduma from Novei Kochavim, and Dama was his name. Va'amri la Remetz Shmo. Okay, some people had his name as Remetz. Amar lahem Rabbi Eliezer, Misham Raya. So they tried to prove against him. Look, they bought the paraduma. How could you say you can't buy the paraduma from a Gentile? And he said to them, what, that's a proof? Yisrael hayu mashamrin otam misha'ah shenolda. What do you see here? He said the Jews were watching that animal from the time it was born. So they knew the animal hadn't engaged in bestiality, which means it seems like Rabbi Eliezer is concerned for bestiality and not for what we said before about this drasha and the pasuk. So the answer, Rabbi Eliezer, tarteile. Kicha v'chayishnami l'revia. He needs, number one, for it to be purchased from a Jew, meaning a Jew had to have purchased it from the Gentile, and only after that can we purchase it for the Jew for the purpose of the paraduma. Number two, you also have to make sure that the animal never engaged in bestiality. Okay, so we have two concerns of Rabbi Eliezer, and that resolves the problem. Amar, let's go back now for a minute to the story. Yisrael, but that's not really enough because nichush dilma rave le'ima. Maybe you have to worry, or we should be concerned that the mother engaged in bestiality, ki hava ma'abra, when she was pregnant. And why would that be an issue? Well, the Rava said, Vlad hanogachat asura, he uvladat nagcho. Vlad hanirbat asura, he uvladan nirbu. Rava says, when it comes to bringing a sacrifice, you can't bring an animal that killed a person as a sacrifice. Okay, if an animal gored a person and the person died, not only is the animal forbidden to bring as a sacrifice, also its offspring if it was pregnant, because we say it was one whole unit. It was the animal with the offspring inside that did the killing. And likewise for Vlad Hanirbat, if the mother engaged in bestiality from when the offspring was conceived, then the offspring also is considered, right, can't be used as a sacrifice. So why did it help that they watched the offspring? They had to have watched the mother. So I say, fine, Ema, let's just fix it. Okay, from the time it was conceived, the Jews were watching to make sure there was no bestiality. You have to imagine, right? You can imagine the scene. They knew that Dama ben Netina had a red heifer. Now, the problem is, how did they know that before, when it was just conceived, it was going to be a red heifer? That we're going to have to deal with. But assuming they heard there was this rumor that he had a red heifer, so they started watching the animal. Well, now they're going to say, right, now, wait a minute. Don't we also have to be concerned that the mother engaged in bestiality before before the offspring was even conceived? Why would that be an issue? Well, ditnan kol psulim l'kavei mizbeach v'ladotehem mutarim. Okay, this so far sounds good. Anyone who's disqualified on the altar, their offspring is fine. So if the mother engaged in bestiality, the offspring should be fine. But Tane Allah, but it says on that Braita, or that Mishnah, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer oseo. Rabbi Eliezer forbids. So here you see, he even forbids the offspring if the mother at some point he engaged in bestiality. So now this really depends on two different understandings of the Machloket Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi and the rabbis here. Hanichal Rava de Amar Rava. Okay, according to Rava, this makes sense because what did Rava say? Amar Rava Amar Rav Nachman. Machloket kishen yirbu kishehem mukdashim. This is only if the mother was designated already to be to be used for a sacrifice, and then engaged in bestiality, and then later it just wasn't used yet as for the sacrifice, became pregnant, and then gave birth to this offspring, right? Then the offspring is going to be a problem. Aval, and that's when there's a machlok, and that's what Rabbi Eliezer will say it's a problem, and the rabbis will say no, it's not a problem. The offspring is fine because the mother wasn't pregnant yet. Aval kashehem cholim, but if they were, kashem chulin, if they were chulin, right, not sanctified at all yet, divrei al kol mutarin, and everyone agrees they were permitted. Now let's apply this. According to this, the paraduma wasn't consecrated at all. It's not a sacrifice. So then it's enough to just watch the mother from the time of conception. But Rav Huna bar Chinina, Amar Rav Nachman, but there was this debate between Rava and Rav Huna bar Chinina, what Rav Nachman actually said. According to Rav Huna bar Chinina, in the name of Rav Nachman, he says, and this is not going to work out very well for us, Machloket kishen yirbu, kishem chulin. The machloket is when they engage in bestiality, when they were still chulin. That's when they have a big debate. And that's when Rabbi Eliezer forbids even then. Everybody agrees that once the animal was meant to be a korban and then engages in bestiality, that destroys the offspring, even if the offspring wasn't in utero at the time. So then, now we're stuck because the para aduma, then the mother should have been washed even before that. To which they answer, fine, change it a little. So now they say, the mother was being watched also by the Jews. Okay, they watched this animal way back. Okay, we're going to get back to how did they have any idea to watch the mother and thinking there was going to be a red heifer there. We're going to have to deal with that problem soon. But now we have another issue. We keep having issues with this situation. Maybe the grandmother, right? The mother's mother would be a problem. If that one engaged in bestiality, to which the Gemara says, fine, kule hai lo chashina, you've gone too far. We're not worried about that. Grandchild of a the grandmother, but whatever we call it, the grand animal, engaged in bestiality, that's fine. We don't worry about 2 generations away. But now we go back to Amar Mar, Yisrael Yom Shamrino Tamisha. So now we have this idea that they watched the animal before it was conceived. Okay, now we're going to ask the question, even though we even said the mother was watched even before that, but we'll put that mother aside for right now. Even this raises a problem. Minna yadinan. How did they know that it was going to be a red heifer? We don't know it's a red heifer till it's born. Well, Amarav Kahana kos adom avirim lefanea b'sha'ah she'oleh aleha zachal. This is a belief they had in the time of the Gemara, that if you looked at something while you were, I've seen this in the Gemara a few times, you look at something while you're engaged in sexual relations, the offspring will look like what you're looking at. Okay, it will resemble that. It's a little bit of a strange belief, but they had this understanding. So they say the same thing. They basically tried to prod along red heifers from being born. They would take a cup with something red in it. Okay, this red cup, or I guess it was a red cup. Does it say again? A kosadom. A red cup they would put in front of the animal while it was mating. Okay, and then that's how they knew they were watching this animal from conception, because they put the red cup there hoping it was going to become a red heifer. So they say, Ihachi, wait a minute. If you can create a red heifer by putting a red cup here, then why is it so expensive? It should be easy to do. So they say no, because if you have even 2 hairs that are not red, okay, you have 2 black hairs or 2 white hairs, just mess up the paraduma. So if you have black or white hairs, messes up the paraduma, which means it might be not so hard to create a red heifer, but to create a red heifer that's actually perfect and what we need for this process of creating the paraduma waters, the purification waters, that already is unlikely. So it's not so easy to do, even if you try this solution. So now they say, now why were they doing this to Dama ben Natina's animal? If there's a way to make a red heifer out of any cow, then why don't we just do it with anyone, right? Why don't they always put this red cup? Why were they doing it with Dama's animal? To which they answer, right? They don't even answer how were they able to do this and access them as animal. Okay, I don't know. But Amar Rav Kahana bimuchzeket. She was known to be, in other words, the family, Dama ben Netina, was known that they had a certain type that could easily breed red heifers. It's not like you could take any animal and put this red cup and it'll create a red heifer. There was an understanding that he had animals that were, he had a herd that could make red heifers, and therefore they did it with his, hoping that, and that's why they watched the animals there. They were watching them because they knew that there was a good chance of red heifers, and that could explain why they even watched the mothers even before they did this red cup, whatever solution they had. Yativ. Now we start another thing. Yativ Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Akila to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. We're actually have two versions of the story, and the only thing's really going to change are who was talking and that kind of thing, but the content's really the same. So in version number one, we have Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha that are sitting to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. They're sitting in the doorway of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha's house. So one of them gets up, starts talking, and says, it wasn't just paraduma. Rabbi Eliezer forbade any animal bought from a Gentile for sacrifices. So the other one says, what did his friends say back to him to counter this? Rabbi Eliezer, right? What did they counter to Rabbi Eliezer? Kol tzon kedar yikbetzulach. Okay, all the tzon kedar yikbetzulach. Okay, you have to read this pasuk. Okay, this is describing in the future. It's a pasuk from Mishael, chapter 60, where the Gentiles are all going to come to the temple and they're going to bring, right, they're going to gather all these sheep, flocks, and they're going to bring them on the altar. So here you see Gentiles, right, animals can be brought on the altar. Amar lahem Rabbi Eliezer, kulam girim grulim hem latid lavo. They're all gerim. They might not have the best intention, but they're all converts, and therefore they're all making sure that their animals are the right animals, right? Or maybe we call them gerim. They protect from bestiality. They know the rules because they're basically somewhat converts. Amar Rav Yosef, Mikra. What's the pasuk where we get this from? Ki az ahafoch el amim safa brura v'chulei. You have to read the rest of these pasukim. As in Sfanya, likro kulam b'shem Hashem, lavdo shchem echad. So what do you see? They're all going to call out the name of God. That's what we're talking about here. So they're all gerim. That's how we know it. Amar le Abaye. So Abaye says to Rav Yosef, v'dilma me'avodat kochavim hu dahadar b'hu. Right? Maybe it's just avodat kochavim, but maybe it's not bestiality. Maybe they're still engaging in bestiality with their animals. Amar le Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef answers, lavdo shchem echad ktiv. It says, Lavdosh chem echad, like with one shoulder. What it really means is they're full, right? They're really going in to worship God properly. So you can't say they engage in bestiality. Okay, that's our version. Rav Papa Matnehachi. So his version of the story, again, let's just review who said what. We had two rabbis, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Rabbi Ami, that were sitting. One said to the other one answered. Then Rabbi Yosef and Abai, the second part is Rabbi Yosef and Abai. They start having this discussion. What's the pasuk about the fact that the Gentiles are going to worship God? And, like, how do we know that they were gerim, as one of them had suggested? And then they have this back and forth about that pasuk. Does it really mean, right, that they didn't engage in bestiality? And then, Rabbi Yosef said, what? Abai questioned, Rabbi Yosef answered. According to the second version, Rabbi Zvi bat Nehachi, utravayu amrei. It wasn't one said to the other, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, but they both said together. They both held Rabbi Yitzchak disqualified all sacrifices, utravayu amrei, and then both of them said, my utive lechavrohi Rabbi Eliezer. What did the friends respond? And then they responded with the same response. Kotzon kedar yikabtzulach. They gather all the animals and they're going to bring them to the temple as sacrifices. And then Amar Rabbi Eliezer, kulam girim gruim hem latid lavo. Right, and then Rabbi Eliezer explained back to the retort to the rabbis, but they were all converts, so it wasn't a concern. Umaykra, and then they continued and said, and what's the pasuk? It wasn't that Rabbi Yosef came in. What's the pasuk that Rabbi Eliezer proved that they were gerim gruim? Ki azeh pochalamim safar bura lekro kulam b'shem Hashem. And they quote that other pasuk. And only then comes in Rabbi Yosef, and instead of Abai was the one who questioned Rabbi Yosef about the pasuk, this time Rabbi Yosef questions the bringing of this pasuk. Maybe it was just from Avodah Zarah, not from bestiality. And then Abai answers, Amar le Abai, Shchem echad ktiv. It says Shechem Echad, and that's why. Okay, so it's just the same sugya, just a bit of a different of who said what. Meitive. So now we bring a contradictory source. Vayomer Moshe, Gamata titem biyadenu. Okay, we're now going to have a slew of questions on the fact that Rabbi Eliezer would say, can't bring animals brought from Gentiles as sacrifices. But wait, we're going to see all over the place, there's psukim that animals brought from Gentiles were brought as sacrifices. So let's go one by one. Vayomer Moshe. Moshe says to Paro when they're in Egypt, Gamata titem biyadenu zvachim va'olot. Okay, you're going to give us animals so we can go worship our God. Kodem Matan Torah Shani. Okay, that's an easy one. It was before Matan Torah. There wasn't a prohibition. Tashma. How about this one? Vayikach Yitro Chote Moshe Ola Zvachim Lelohim. This is when Moshe comes to Yitro. This is right before they got the Torah, actually. So we're going to get back to that. In Parsha Yitro, before the Torah is given, it says that Yitro, right, brought Moshe Ola and Zvachim for Moshe to offer to God. So what do you see here? You can bring sacrifices from Gentile animals, from Yitro. So Yitro Nami Kodem Matan Torah. Okay, Yitro was also before Matan Torah, as we can see from the Torah. Well, not everybody agrees to that. It's actually a bit machloket. You can read the Ramban al Torah there. Hani Chalaman Damar Yitro Kodem Matan Torah. If you hold Yitro is before Matan Torah, great. Ela Laman Damar, but there's a whole debate. There's no real order in the Torah, and it might be there for a particular reason, but it's not its place. It was actually after Matan Torah. One of the reasons is because Moshe was judging the people. They hadn't received the Torah. What was he judging them about? So Elalamanda Amar, turning out on a bit, Yitro la'achar Matan Torah hava. If he was after Matan Torah, ma'ikal amemer. How can you explain? Ella, remember how we explained in the beginning with the paraduma that it was bought by a person who was a Jew first, and then, so we can say Yitro Yisrael Zavin. Maybe he bought from a Jew. Okay. What Jew that was from to buy it from is a very good question. Anyway, we're going to put that question aside. Tashma, another difficulty. Vayomer Shaul me'amaleki hevium. If you remember, Shaul was supposed to kill all the Amalekim, and he keeps the Agag, the king, and he also keeps their animals, even though he's supposed to kill them, and he wasn't supposed to take from the stuff from the Amalekim, but he does anyway. And Shmuel says to him, what's this voice of the tzon that I hear? And Shaul says, I took these animals from the Amalekim, Asher Chamal Ha'am al Mitav Tzon v'Bakar, because the nation had mercy on the tzon and the bakar, on their livestock. Laman's Bach Lashem Elokecha, in order that we can bring sacrifices to God. And he was trying to say they had good motivation. They wanted to use it as sacrifices. Anyway, what do you see here? He wanted to bring in his sacrifices from Gentiles. So my metav, demei metav. Oh, it just means the value of the good animals. In other words, they brought the good animals back in order for, right, they took the best animals so they can sell them and buy other animals with them and offer those up. And that resolves the problem. Umay shna metav. So why does it say, or masha katav metav? Why does it say specifically metav? Then why did they take the best if it's just the value? Well, it's much easier to sell a good animal. If you sell a poor quality animal, it's much harder to sell. They wanted to be able to quickly sell them and then take the money. Tashma, another difficulty. And again, Rabbi Eliezer, who says you can't bring sacrifices from Gentile animals. Well, look at this pasuk. Vayomer Aravna el David, Yikach v'al Adoni HaMelech hatov be'einav. So Aravna, who is a Gentile, Aravna, David is told there's a plague, and David is told, go to Aravna's house. He's told by the prophet, go to Aravna's house, make a mizbeach there and offer up sacrifices. Okay, in Sefer Divrei Yamim, it says this is the place where ultimately the Beit HaMikdash is built. Okay, and he's told to bring sacrifices. So he goes to Aravna and he says, right, Yikach v'al Adoni HaMelech hatov be'einav. You can take, right, the best, whatever you see here, and offer it up. Re'ah bakar la'olah, here's the bakar. You can use these for korban olah. Hamorigim, buklei bakar leitzim. We'll see in a minute what the morigim are. And the other items that we use for the bakar, you can take, like these wood implements, you can take the wood and use it to make the fire. So what do you see here? How did he buy it from a Gentile? To which they answer, Rav Nachman, Arav ger toshav hayan. He was a ger toshav, okay? He was already like somewhat of a convert, okay? And then ger toshav, we assume, wouldn't have the animals engaged in bestiality. My morigim, what are these morigim? Amar ula mitashel torbil. Okay, that doesn't really help us. A bed of torbil. My mitashel torbil, the Gemara asks, is a dekor kasad de daishan. This doesn't help us too much either, but They explained daishan is from threshing. They would use these wooden boards and they had teeth in them, and then they would have the animals ride over them, and that would thresh the wheat or the grains. So Amar of Yosef Maikra, where do we have a pasuk about this? Do we know what the Morigim are? Hine samtich lemorag charutz chadash bal pipiot tido sharim v'tido kvaot kemotz tasim. Okay, so here I make you like a morag, a charutz. It has charitzim. It has these teeth in it. It's chadash bal pipiot, right? It has these like kind of sharp parts on them, and right, the charutz I guess has holes in it. I guess is the charutz. 1 second. Like charutz. Right, it has charitzim. Yeah, I guess it has holes in it. Anyway, it's an implement used for right tido sharim, tido kvaot. Right, you're going to be like a threshing thing, which basically crushes things. You're going to crush the other nations, and you know, even mountains and that kind of thing. You're going to make it like motes, like the chaff. Okay, meitiv. Another problem. Okay, we're just quoting source after source after source, which seems to really go against Rabbi Eliezer. I mean, each time we have an answer, but really seems to say it seems to be not such an issue buying animals from Gentiles and using them at the altar. Meiti. What about this one? Now, if you remember the whole story with the Aron and the Plishtim took the Aron and then they gave it back after losing, we lost the war. Then they return it and they return it with these, right? Because then there's a big plague and the people, everybody's dying. They want to get rid of it. So they send it back with these cows. Okay, they're actually female cows. We're going to talk about this soon. Okay, so the parot were brought as a sacrifice to God. Hora'at sha'aita. So they say, that's not a problem. Oh, because I didn't really explain, but the parot, the cows they sent back, they offered up as offerings. Okay. Now, what do you see here? They took the parot the Plishtim gave them. There was no middle person there. And they offered them up as offerings. So the answer, Hora'at sha'aita. This was a unique one-time occurrence because they got the Aram back and because the Plishtim sent those as gifts, God allowed it. Okay. But it's not really generally allowed. Hachinami mistabra. This can further be proven because the ilotema hachi olani kevami ika. Right, these cows they were female cows, and you can't offer up olo burnt offerings are always male, and yet they allowed that. It must be because it was hara'at sha'ah. Now, umay kusha, they say, okay, that doesn't prove anything. The female because dilma bebamat yachid. Maybe because here it wasn't done in the temple or the saint or the tabernacle at the time. It was done just on an outside the tabernacle place. Ukid Rabad Bar Ava, and then if you go like Rabad Bar Ava, Damar Rabad Bar Ava, Minayin La'ola Nekeva Shik Sherabe Bamat Yachid. In a Bamat Yachid, you can actually bring a female animal as an offering, as a burnt offering. How do we know this? Shenemar B'Kach Shmuel, Taleh Chalav Echad. Okay, a Taleh is a lamb, and Chalav is a nursing lamb. So we took a female, obviously. Vayaleu Ola. Okay, so what do you see? And he brought it as an offering, and that was on a Bamat Yachid, right? It wasn't brought in the Mishkan. So you see here that that seems to be allowed. That doesn't prove Hara'at. We could still say Hara'at. We just don't have a proof from the fact that it was female. To which they say, wait a minute, there's a small problem with what we just said because Vaya'alehu, Zachar Mashma, that's in that tense, Vaya'alehu, they brought him on the altar. Him is male, not female. So Amarav Nachum Bar Yitzchak, Vaya'aleha ktiv. It should be written as Vaya'aleha, not Vaya'alehu, which would make it feminine. Okay, that's the end of our slew of questions against Rabbi Eliezer, who again, according to what we said, not only does Rabbi Eliezer not allow an animal bought from a Gentile for paraduma, unless you fulfill both conditions, it's bought through somebody else and it was watched, it didn't engage in bestiality. But Rabbi Eliezer also says that when it comes to sacrifices, we brought a whole slew of questions and resolved them. Now we're going to move on to a different attempt, and that's why I started with this today, to reconcile the difference between the Mishnah and the Braita. Again, the Mishnah is saying you can't give your animal for pundak, right, as a pundak for a Gentile to watch because they might have the animal engaged in bestiality, but you can, right, according to the Braita, you can acquire them for a korban. Again, not according to Rabbi Eliezer, but according to the rabbis. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Gvul Yeshla Pchutami Bat Shalosh Shanim Ne'ekeret. Okay, if we go back to the first explanation of Rav, that there's no concern that the Gentile is going to use their own animal for bestiality because they're worried that the animal won't be able to bear offspring. Well, he gives this a boundary. This is only if they're Pchutami Bat Shalosh Shanim Ne'ekeret. Only if they're under 3 will engaging in bestiality cause the animal not to be able to have offspring. Bat shalosh shanim ein carrot. But once the animal's already 3 years old, then there's no concern anymore. And then there's a concern that Gentile might engage in bestiality. So it limits the Braita to only a case where the animal is less than 3 years old. Eitive. Now they say, well, Eitive, we're going to bring in difficulty of kol hani tiyufta. All those slew of questions that we asked in the previous sugya, I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but each one of them shows animals were brought on the altar. So what do you see? How are you going to explain that? So they're going to answer them all, except for we're going to see maybe one. Shane luhu pchutami bat shalosh shanim. And say all of those cases where the animals, where there's psukim that talk about animals being brought on the altar, we can say they were younger than 3 years old. And because they were younger than 3 years old, first of all, a lot of sacrifices have to be within the first or second year of their life. So it actually works not so badly. But anyway, they're all explained as the animal was under 3 years old, and therefore there was no concern because the owner would always make sure the animal didn't engage in bestiality. Otherwise, it would have cost it not to be able to have offspring. But now we're going to go back to one of the questions, one of the difficulties. Tashma. The etaparot, okay, back to these cows that they got from the Plishtim. He'elu ola Hashem. They say, oh, must be, it was less than 3, right? Just like we answered all the other questions. But that's not really going to work. But it said there their sons were tied in the house. Now, the sons, how could they have sons if they were less than 3 years old? We're now going to prove under 3, animals do not give birth to other offspring yet. The Hatznan, it says in the Mishnah, how do we know this? Because we're going to see it from a Mishnah. Para v'chamor mibat shalosh, vadai lekohen. If you have a para and a chamor from an animal that was born from an animal that you bought from a Gentile, that the animal was less than 3 years old, okay, then you purchased it when it was less than 3 years old, then vadai lekohen, then it definitely, the firstborn goes to the kohen, because you know that before 3, they didn't have any offspring. So there's no way there was a behor before. Therefore, the firstborn is a definite behor. But mikava elach, if you purchased it when the animal was already 3 years old, suffix, it's going to be a suffix behor. Okay, so that is going to be a bit of a problem for this interpretation. And then they're going to, right, because now they're going to say you can't explain that source with the parot that it was less than 3 years old, because it just doesn't work. So there's no way they had offspring already, and these parot were described as having offspring, and then how could they have brought it as an offering? This answer doesn't work, and therefore, even though for all the other difficulties that we raised on this interpretation, we were able to say, oh, it was all under 3, this one can't be explained as under 3, so we're actually going to go back to the explanation that was given when we raised this in the first slew of questions that we had, not on this opinion, but the previous opinion, which was, right, that Rabbi Eliezer also disqualified in Korbanot, and it was because of concern for bestiality. And there we said the parot were allowed because it was a horat sha'ah. Normally it's not allowed. This time it was allowed because of a horat sha'ah, and that's how we explained it. We'll explain the same thing here. Vayisharna haparot baderech al derech beit shemesh. Okay, if already we're on the psukim about these parot that were given, that were returned with the Philistines, right? That the Philistines, when they returned the ark, they sent these cows. Well, we're going to see an interesting pasuk about the cows. So it says vayisharna haparot baderech al derech beit shemesh. So they were singing, or at least that's what we assume vayisharna is. It sounds like they're singing, but cows sing. So the Gemara asks, "My vayisharna, what does that mean?" Rabbi Yonatan Mishum Rabbi Meir, Amar Rabbi Yonatan Mishum Rabbi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Meir, Shamru Shira, they actually sang. Ve Rav Zutra Bar Tuvia Amar Rav, Sheyishru Pnehem Keneged Ha'aron V'Amru Shira. He understands it as 2 things. By Yishru Panim, they turned toward to face the Aron, and they said Shira, not just, okay, they did 2 things. Now we have a big question, which is, my Shira Amru, what did they sing, these cows? Okay, first of all, singing cows, interesting in and of itself. Now, what were they singing? We're going to have a slew of possibilities about what they're singing. So, and that's where we're going to end today. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Meir, Az Yashir Moshe v'nei Israel. Okay, they sang Az Yashir, right? It was this great moment. The Aaron is coming back to the Jewish people. They sang what they sang at Kriyat Yam-Suf. Okay, next, Rabbi Yochanan Didei Amar. Now, he said that in the name of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yochanan. But now Rabbi Yochanan himself thinks, V'amartem b'yomahu hodu l'Hashem kiru b'shmo. Okay, and on that day they will say, right, thank God and call out in his name. Okay, so that's a pasuk, right, about this great praise of God. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, third answer, Mizmora Yatma. It's a mizmor that's a yatom. It's an orphan. We'll explain what that means in a minute. Which one is that? Mizmor shiru lashem shir chadash kiniflot asahu shir yamino uzro kacho. Right. This is a great moment of Yeshua, of victory, because we lost the war, but then God, right, makes sure the ark is returned to the Jewish people. So we sing that one. Why is it called Mizmor Yatom? Because all the Mizmorim that start off Mizmor either have Mizmor LeDavid, Mizmor LeTodah, Mizmor for something. This has nothing. It just says Mizmor Shir Lashem. Because of that, it's called an orphaned Mizmor because it's missing the context of it. And here they're saying this is the context of that Mizmor. Rabbi Elazar Amar, Hashem Malach Yirgezu Ami. Okay, the real is the continuation. Yoshev Kruvim Tanu Ta'aretz. The Kruvim will sit and the land will shake, right? Will quake. Okay, meaning it's going to be a problem for the Plishtim because now the Kruvim are back sitting in our possession. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani Amar, Hashem Malach Geut Lavesh. Right? God is wearing his glory because the ark is coming back. Rabbi Yitzchak Navcha Amar, now he's the only one who says something that's not a Mizmor Tilim, not a known song. It's a song like a made-up song, so to speak. But it has to do with the ark, Roni Roni Hashita, because the ark was made of Atzei Shitim. So right, be joyous, the Shita. Hitnofafi Berov Hadarecha Mechusheket Berikmei Zahav. Okay, you should be floating with such excitement because of out of all your glory. Mechusheket Berikmei Zahav, you're covered with gold because the ark was covered in gold. Hamehulala bidvir armon umafuara b'adei adayim. Adei adayim are jewels. Okay, so you're glorified with jewels, and you're muhulala bidvir armon. Now, what is this divir armon? So Rav Sheshet man elaha. So before we say that divir is the Sefer Torah that's inside it. Okay, so the divir is the Torah. In a minute, we'll see how we get from divir to Torah. So now they say, Rabbi Yitzchak. Some people say that Rabbi Yitzchak's explanation that this song was said wasn't actually in the context of these cows that sang, but it was more in the context of Vayihi ben so Aaron, Vayomer Moshe, Kumashem, Kumashem. Okay, but even so, right, when the ark in the desert would go, right? So Vayomer Hashem Kuma. Shem v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misenecha mipanecha, right? And the enemies, your enemies will go to the sidelines, and right, they'll run away from you. So that's when they would sing this song. Okay, when the ark would move in the desert, that was when they sang this song. So there's two versions because also they were carrying the Aron with them, right? Vayibin soah ha'aron, and the Aron would move, they would sing this song. Yisrael my Amru. So now, what did the Jews say? If Moshe said that, so what did the Jews say? Rabbi Yitzchak. So sorry, I didn't explain this clearly. When the Aron would go and Moshe would say Kuma Hashem, Yisrael my Amru, what would the Jews say? The Jews would answer Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Roni Roni Hashita, etc. So the Jews would respond to Moshe. He would say that, but they would sing this song. Amarav. So now we have two etymological things, like definitions of words. Amarav, Kiman Karu Parsai L'Safra Dvir. Okay, according to who do the Persians now call Sefer Dvir? Okay, as we see here, this said Dvir, and also the Persians apparently call a book Dvir. So Mehacha we're going to see a source for it in the Torah. V'sham Dvir Lifnim Kiryat Sefer. This place is now called Dvir, and it used to be called Kiryat Sefer. So you see Dvir and Sefer are interchangeable. And I see there's a note here. It's not Rav Ashi. It should say Amar Rav Ashi. Kiman Karu Parsai Lenida Dashtana. Where does that come from? Mehacha Ki Derech Nashim Li. This is where Rachel, and right, she's hiding the trafim and she doesn't want to get up. She's hiding the idols. She doesn't want to get up for Laban. So she says, "Oh, I have I'm menstruating right now." So she says, Ki derech nashim li. Now, how does this have to do with dashtana? Well, derech nashim is dalid, and the shim from nashim, dashtana. Okay, it's not exactly the best, no tricon as we call it, but it's saying it's like a shortened version of that sentence, and that's where they get it from. So we're basically saying that the Persian language has roots in our Torah. Okay, what do we do today? We started with the Rabbi Eliezer about the Paraduma, and you can't buy it from Gentiles. And then we said, what do you mean? What about the Dama Benatina stories? And what about the Avnei Shoam? And then we moved to forget about the Avnei Shoam, even the Paraduma. And then we said, well, he requires two things, right? As long as it's sold to somebody else, right? First to a Jew, and then you purchase from the Jew for the Paraduma purposes. And it needs to be watched from making sure it didn't engage in bestiality. We even said the mother, from even before the offspring was conceived, needs to have been watched. And then we saw that there was a propensity for paradumas in Dama Benetina's flock, and that's why they were watching, okay, from way back to make sure. Okay, and they had this solution about how they created paradumas. Then we had two versions of this, the way this whole thing went about, but either which way we have that Rabbi Eliezer was also said this about sacrifices. And then we had a slew of questions, difficulties. And then we had that same slew of questions on the next resolution to the contradiction, which was if you're worried about the Braita that says you can't use animals for sacrifices, then, sorry, you can use animals for sacrifice, but you can't put them in the pundak. Well, you can use animals for sacrifice as long as they're under 3. And then we answered all the questions in that by saying, oh yeah, all those sources that said you can bring sacrifice are all under 3, except for that one with the parrot, because the parrot didn't work that they were under 3 because they also had offspring with them. And we proved that you can't, the animals don't give birth when they're under 3, and therefore they must have been over 3, and therefore must be some other reason. And they say, oh yeah, it was a horacha. One time occurrence, God allowed it. Okay, then once we were talking about that, we talked about what the parrot they sang. What did they sing? And we had all sorts of possibilities, but which Tehillim they sung, or perhaps it was some different song entirely, or perhaps that different song was actually talking about when the Aron would go. Moshe would say his pasuk, and then the Jews would respond with that song. So there was a debate about which statement on what issue Rabbi Yitzchak talked about that song that supposedly was like, a made-up song, meaning it doesn't have any source in the text anywhere. With that, we finished, and then we ended with a little etymology of Persian words that have sources in the Torah. And from there, we finished, wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.